When people talk about the M4 Sherman, the usual things come up. Thin armor, a cannon that really struggled with German tanks, and of course the whole bursting into flames thing. Grim nicknames like Ronson or Tommy Cooker gave it a reputation for being basically useless. But that's what you get if you imagine a Sherman and a Tiger parked on opposite ends of a 1,000-meter field and tell them to duel. That version of history is simple and wrong. Because when you zoom out and look at how these tanks were actually used, the picture flips. In fact, there were three key areas where the Sherman absolutely broke German armor in World War II. And to understand how that happened, we need to start with one thing most people skip: what the Sherman was even built to do. See, the Sherman wasn't designed to fight tanks. It was made for infantry support. Back in the 1930s, the US was still figuring out what tanks were even for. Their early idea, the M2A1, was basically a metal box with 9 machine guns slapped on it. Because infantry support meant laying down fire, right? Then came the tank destroyer concept, which looked good on paper and performed well in specific scenarios. But as the Germans introduced revolutionary combined arms tactics with tanks, infantry, artillery, and air force all working together, the old plans fell apart fast. So the US needed something new that could do most of the things needed on the battlefield within a single vehicle. First came the M3 Lee, which was a stopgap design until something better could be developed. It was far from ideal, but it was based on a chassis that worked. So, to save time and not build something better all the way from scratch, that same chassis became the foundation for the M4 Sherman. Now at this point, the United States was fighting Japan in the Pacific and Germany in North Africa and then Europe. President Roosevelt wanted 45,000 tanks a year. That number sounds insane until you realize what the US was actually aiming for. And this brings us to the first major area where the Sherman broke German armor, even before a single shell was fired: production and logistics. Let's start with the basics. The M4A1 Sherman had a radial engine, basically an aircraft engine adapted for tanks, and a fully cast hull, which was a bit complex for such extreme mass production. But here's the trick. The US broke the Sherman into 5 main variants, and each of those had about 10 sub-variants. However, despite all that variation, as many parts as possible were standardized and interchangeable. That meant a Sherman crew could swap out major components like engines, transmissions, and differentials between any variant in the field, and often within hours. And it wasn't just the tanks. The same chassis powered the M10 and M36 tank destroyers, and even self-propelled artillery. Now compare that to the German approach. They built beautiful and revolutionary tanks, no question, with better optics, thicker armor, and much more powerful guns. But they were over-engineered to the point of madness. Every model was almost custom handmade, and just when production started to catch up, Hitler would step in with some fantasy-level upgrade demand that forced a redesign. The result was bottlenecks, delays, and fragile logistics. Panthers and Tigers looked quite impressive on the battlefield, but keeping them running was a nightmare. Just as a side note, early Panther's final drive lasted less than a full tank of fuel, and replacing it was everything but quick and simple. If you were replacing the gearbox on a Sherman, you could do it with a crane and a team of mechanics in a few hours. Or from 5 broken-down tanks, make 3 that work, sacrificing 2 for parts. Try that with a Panther, and you're talking about an entire crew working for a couple of days, assuming the part they needed even existed nearby. And now add the overall numbers to that. Germany built roughly 1,300 Tiger Is, 6,000 Panthers, and 8,000 Panzer IVs. The total number of Shermans produced was almost 50,000, and these were reliable tanks you could fix, move, and get back into the fight much faster than Germans could. So now you've got tens of thousands of Shermans being pumped out with interchangeable parts and simple repairs. But what happened when these tanks actually hit the battlefield? Before that, we have to explain what actually makes a good tank. People like to point at big guns and thick armor, but that's only part of the equation. A tank lives or dies by 4 key traits: firepower, protection, mobility, and something that often gets overlooked: reliability. Because a tank that breaks down before the fight even starts might as well be a bunker. Reliability isn't glamorous, but it wins battles. If you compare the Sherman to its closest German counterpart, the Panzer IV is in many ways its equivalent, as both were upgraded and modified constantly during the war. The Panzer IV went from an infantry support vehicle to a tank killer, trying to keep up with better Allied designs. It's important to understand that comparing the Sherman to heavy tanks like Tigers and Panthers isn't really accurate. The real one-on-one matchup was between the Sherman and the Panzer IV, and in that matchup, things were a lot more balanced. The later models of the Panzer IV were fitted with a long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun, which was quite dangerous to Shermans, and the upgraded frontal hull armor was also a problem. But the Sherman still had secret sauce going for it that the Panzer IV could never fully match, besides the numbers and reliability. Before we move on, let's just real quick clear up the Sherman's tendency to burst into flames when hit. The ammo storage design placed shells along the side walls of the hull, and when the armor was penetrated, it would set off the ammo like fireworks. But that changed drastically when wet stowage was introduced. Instead of just putting shells in unprotected open racks, they put them in armored bins surrounded by jackets filled with a special mixture that would spill out and delay the fire once it was penetrated. The ammo rack was also removed from the side sponsons to the tank's floor, where it had much less chance of getting hit. Once that upgrade rolled out, the chances of an immediate fire after a hit dropped from around 80% to about 15%. And when combined with wider and well-positioned hatches, the Sherman had one of the highest crew survivability rates, with on average 1.3 tankers killed per destroyed Sherman. Now, when we talk about the Sherman in actual combat, it had three features that, when combined, gave it a secret sauce edge over German armor in real fighting conditions. First, the turret traverse speed. The Sherman's turret could do a full rotation in about 17 seconds. A Panzer IV needed about 26, which was not bad, but the Panther and Tiger needed around a minute. In a close fight, whoever gets their gun on target first usually wins, so the Sherman could already be firing before the German crew even had their sights lined up. Second, the rate of fire. Sherman crews could pump out 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The Tiger managed only about 4 to 6, while the Panther wasn't much better, so a single Sherman could be throwing out shells 3 to 4 times faster. Multiply that by a unit of Shermans working together, and remember, there were always more of them, and now the German tank is taking perhaps 5 hits for each one it sends out. Even if the armor is not penetrated, Sherman crews often used high explosive and white phosphorus rounds instead of armor piercing, so they're smashing vision blocks, periscopes, tracks, maybe the gun mantlet, and only one of them is enough to hit the hatch or something critical and make the German tank crew bail out. And that medium velocity gun everyone thinks is useless when it comes to armor penetration actually had very good high explosive shells. And finally, gyro stabilization. The Sherman had a vertical gyro stabilizer for its main gun. It didn't let you fire accurately on the move like a modern tank, but it did keep the gun roughly aligned with the target while the tank was moving. That made it easier to lay the first shot quickly after stopping. The system was complex, and a lot of crews turned it off, but it was quite useful and it shaved critical seconds off the time it took to aim. Add those three things together, and suddenly you're looking at a tank that didn't need to be tougher than a Tiger. It just needed to shoot first, shoot more, and stay in the fight longer, which, as it turns out, is exactly what it did. So when you step back and look at it, the Sherman wasn't some unstoppable super tank. It was moderate across the board with good firepower for infantry support, decent protection when you exclude high-velocity anti-tank guns, and solid maneuverability. Nothing flashy, nothing record-breaking, but the areas where it excelled were the ones that actually won wars: reliability, mass production, and ease of maintenance in the field. But when people talk about the Sherman getting outclassed, they're usually thinking of fights against Tigers and Panthers, which were heavy tanks and were never supposed to be its regular opponents in the first place. They were rare during the war, but were publicized later like it was an everyday occurrence. And yes, for Allied tank crews, going up against German heavy armor with a tank that wasn't built for that job could feel like being set up to fail. Also, when you take a look at what happened after World War II, you see which was the better tank actually. The French army, for example, inherited captured German Panthers and American-supplied Shermans after the war. The Panthers kept breaking down and were just a nightmare to keep in working order, and they were retired very soon after. The Shermans, on the other hand, were easy to upgrade and much easier to keep in service, and they stuck around with many nations long after the war for which they were designed. The very last frontline Sherman unit wasn't phased out until 2003 by the Chilean army. That's nearly 60 years of service. So yeah, it's easy to look at wartime footage and see a Tiger blowing through a Sherman and think that tells the whole story. But the truth is, the Sherman wasn't trying to win a beauty contest. It was built to win a war, and it did exactly that.